फैज दे लफ्ज़ दुराए सुने देश दे गीत जगाए फैज दे लफ्ज़ दुराए सुने देश दे गीत जगाए आओ फैज दे लफ्ज़ दुराए सुने देश दे गीत जगाए ओ सिंधी बलोची पंजाबी पठानो सिंधी बलोची पंजाबी पठानो
In many countries of the world today, poetry is still very much a part of popular culture.
सारे रल मिल जश्न मनाइए
When dictators stifle political expression, people find a voice through their poets. Two outstanding examples this century, both now dead, are the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda and Faiz Ahmed Faiz of Pakistan. This film is about Faiz.
आओ फैज दे लफ्ज़ दुराए सुने देश दे गीत जगाए
Faiz died in Lahore, the city in which he had spent some of the most productive years of his life, in November 1984. A year later, the regime reluctantly let the Lahoris organize a festival in his memory. People from a wide cross-section of society came together to mark the first anniversary of his death. Faiz's poetry was not broadcast on the government-controlled media. Until recently, even his published work had been banned in Pakistan. But his poems had become familiar to millions of people through private gatherings and public readings.
हमने इस इश्क में क्या खोया है, क्या सीखा है, मुझ तेरे और को समझाऊं, तो समझा न सकूं, आज भी सीखी, गरीबों की हिमायत सीखी, क्या सोहरमान के दुख दर्द के मानी सीखे, ज़ेर दस्तों के मसाइब को समझना सीखा, सर्द आहों के रुखे जर्द के मानी सीखे। जब कहीं बैठ के रोते हैं वो बेकस जिनके अश्क आँखों में बिलकते हुए सो जाते हैं, नातवानों के नवालों पे चपकते हैं वो ख्वाब, बाजू तोले हुए मंडलाते हुए आते हैं। जब कभी बिकता है बाजार में मजदूर का गोश्त, शाहराहों पर गरीबों का लहू बहता है, आग सी सीने में रह के बनती है ना कुछ, अपने दिल पे मुझे काबू ही नहीं रहता है।
He has never accepted defeat, Never accepted defeat, He always has been a poet of hope. And that hope actually has been a great inspiring force for millions of people in our country. Even now, he is no more with us, but his poetry inspires. But why should it inspire? Because first, he represents our own urges, our own hopes, our aspirations. He reflects our own sufferings and sorrows, and joys and happiness, all. And then he represents also our dreams, and our hopes.
He is the poet who goes to the root cause of events. Doesn't deal with the symptoms. So, I like it. And above all, he is very calm, flowing, melodious voice. You can sing him. And when you sing him, and I have seen letters written by prisoners in death cells, that they maintain themselves by singing Faiz.
Faiz is important as a poet, and I think it's necessary for British people in particular to remember how important poetry is in Pakistan. There's a nice saying of the late Edward Thompson about the British, that they have a successfully cultivated distaste for poetry. The Pakistanis have never done that. Poetry is immensely popular, and it has a tradition of live recitation, which takes it to an audience of people, millions of people who can't read and write, will appreciate poetry, love poetry.
Protest poetry इस ज़माने में जितनी भरपूर तौर पे लिखी गई वो किसी और अहद में नहीं लिखी गई और ग़ालिबन उसकी यही वजह थी कि एक तो बहुत जबर था और एक कि बहुत ज़्यादा पाबंदियां थीं तो जितना किसी चीज़ को दबाया जाए उसने अपना रास्ता तो उतनी ही वो आवाज़ और बुलंद होती है उसके बाद चूँकि हमारे पास और कोई ज़रिया नहीं था मिसाल के तौर पर रेडियो टेलीविज़न और किसी हद तक प्रेस गवर्नमेंट के कब्ज़े में था तो मुशायरों का एक बहुत अफादी पहलू ये था कि उसमें शायरों ने उन नज़मों को पढ़ना शुरू किया जो रेडियो से ब्रॉडकास्ट नहीं हो सकती थी टेलीविज़न पे नहीं हो सकती थी बाद पर्चों में नहीं छप सकती थी तो उससे लोगों ने देखा कि ये कुछ हमारी आवाज़ है
आज के नाम और आज के गम के नाम आज का गम के है जिंदगी के भरे गुलसितां से खफा जर्द
Coincidentally, two of the subcontinent's greatest poets, Iqbal and Faiz, both came from the same small district. Faiz was born in 1911 in this village near Sialkot. His father was a traveller and adventurer who ultimately arrived at Cambridge and Lincoln's Inn, but he was only a modest success as a lawyer in Sialkot. Faiz was sent to the local school where he learnt Urdu and conceived a passion for books and pamphlets which stayed with him till the end of his life. He went on to Government College, Lahore. It was built in 1865 to train an indigenous elite which could help the British govern their Indian Empire.
He took his master's degree in English literature as well as in Arabic literature. At home he had read Persian literature and Urdu literature. So he was fully familiar with at least literatures of 4 languages, Arabic, English, Urdu and Persian. So Apart from the traditional education, he had this Western education also as his background. And you can very easily spot the influences of the romantic British poets, on his poetry, particularly Keats and Shelley and Byron.
Government College was the foremost educational institution of northern India and one of its main centers of intellectual activity. Poets like Iqbal and Sufi Tabassum dominated the literary scene. Any young person with ideas and ideals would attempt to set them to verse. Faiz was no exception. This environment provided him with literary inspiration, but it was the Russian Revolution that made a great impact on him politically. And the progressive writers' movement, an offspring of Indian communism, found in Faiz a lifelong adherent.
Faiz appeared upon the poetic scene at a time when you can say that there were three main trends in poetry. First, of the continuation of the traditional trend, particularly that of the Urdu love lyric, the ghazal, and secondly, there was the trend initiated by the progressive writers, people who dedicated their art to the liberation of the country from British rule and to the reform of society and destroying the oppressive practices of society. And the third trend was one which to some extent was a reaction from the progressive trend, people who thought that art couldn't and shouldn't be propaganda, and wanted to be modern but didn't want poetry full of political messages. And Faiz was located quite firmly in the progressive trend, but at the same time he was a sufficiently skillful operator in the other two fields to gain support and admiration from the supporters of the other two trends.
In 1938, Faiz met Alice, one of two English sisters drawn to India, not by the Raj, but by the struggle against it.
I suppose it took some time to fall in love, not exactly, but one thought one should wait, because Faiz was a poor man. He had a big family that he was helping. His family had been extremely well off at one time, but then after his father died, when things became difficult. And then his family was orthodox, unlike Dacia's family. And I don't think they looked very favorably on the sort of this favorite son or favorite brother or favorite nephew being married to an Englishwoman. And we decided to wait until such time as the family agreed to the marriage.
In 1941, his family finally relented. Alice and Faiz embarked on a marriage which was to last till his death. Faiz's interest in Marxism attracted him to Indian communism, although he never actually joined the Communist Party. When the Soviet Union was attacked, he, like many other communists, joined the British Indian Army. He ended up as a colonel in charge of propaganda. Salima, the first of his two children, was born during the war, and Muniza a few years later.
Up till 47, I find that Faiz was, in a sense, a beautiful life and a beautiful person who was full of happiness, full of conviction, and they had plenty of company on the individual scale. They had a few dozen of them, and they were thriving in every sense of the term, in their own, if I can borrow a contemporary expression, subculture, the romantic, idealist subculture, backed up by classical application, and not just empty bohemianism supporting ideas and ideals. So they lived their own life, they did their own thing, and in the pursuit of those ideas. But then came 47, and it was like an earthquake.
After the end of the war, the movement for independence engulfed the whole of India, but religious divisions also widened. Hindus and Muslims began to fight each other. Eventually, progressive writers like Faiz came to accept the idea of a separate state for India's Muslims, Pakistan. Faiz had been working as a teacher. He had also become well known as a poet and a political activist. He now turned to journalism.
Mir Fakharuddin invited him. He was starting this group of papers, Progressive Papers Limited, and he asked Faiz to become the editor of the group. At that time, there was the Pakistan Times and Imroz, and he became the editor, so we made Lahore our home, which Faiz liked very much, of course. And it became known internationally too, and particularly in Asia and India, as the paper which was the voice of hopeful democracy in Pakistan.
Faiz has created a lobby which broadly stood for democratic rule, civil liberties, social justice, rights of the peasants and the working class. And every young man in town in those days was attracted towards Faiz because Faiz offered a solution to the questions that were agitating the minds of the youth.
Most of us who thought that after the withdrawal of the British, after we have our own independent sovereign states, conditions would improve, you know. But most of us were disillusioned, you know. It was one set of oppressors replaced by another set of oppressors, you know.
ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब नजीदा सहर वो इंतज़ार था जिसका ये वो सहर तो नहीं ये वो सहर तो नहीं जिसकी आरज़ू लेकर चले थे यार कि मिल जाएगी कहीं न कहीं फलक के दश्त में तारों की आखिरी मंजिल फलक के दश्त में तारों की आखिरी मंजिल कहीं तो होगा शबे सुस्त मौत का साहिल कहीं तो जाके रुकेगा सफीनाए ग़मे दिल अभी गरानी शब में कमी नहीं आई निजात दीदा दिल की घड़ी नहीं आई चले चलो कि वो मंजिल अभी नहीं आई
After all that carnage, 1 million people died, they were killed, butchered in those riots, communal riots at that time. After this, that settled down on that. And the Hindus and the Sikhs had left this place. And there were none of them to found anymore, except their properties. Movable, immovable property, and their jobs. We must not forget jobs, because that was perhaps even more important than their physical properties. There was a scramble for the jobs, the properties, absolute mad scramble. It was a very disconcerting spectacle. And coupled with that, there was a political shift. And that is that you had the beginnings of bigotry. You had the beginnings of, shall I say, what you experience now and associate with martial law governments. The beginnings were there right in 48. And then it was started by the then Muslim League leadership.
Nationalist military officers considered the idea of overthrowing the government in 1951, a plot in which some communist leaders were also implicated. It was used as a pretext to round up a large number of prominent radical figures.
Must have been very, very early morning. It was before dawn. But what I remember is my mother waking me up and saying, kiss Abu, because he's going away. And I remember being half asleep, him kissing me. I remember going back to sleep again. But then when I woke up, which must have been a couple of hours later, I got up and I found the house was surrounded by police. And I came out onto the veranda and I looked down, and there were sort of hordes of policemen all over the place. But obviously something had happened which was not easily explained. But we didn't know what. He'd just been taken away. And I remember that when the newspapers came in a little later, there were the headlines, which I was old enough to read, which said that there had been this conspiracy and against the state, and that there was a host of names, and my father's name was among the names.
Then he went to jail. That was an important point, not only in the life of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, but also in the history of this country. Because what is known as the Pindi conspiracy case, there might have been a conspiracy, we are not aware of the records, and they have not been made public. But I'm aware of another conspiracy, and that was the conspiracy of the establishment against the people of Pakistan. Because it was in 1951, at the beginning of 1951, that the establishment, the rulers of this country decided that they will abandon all their democratic professions and rule people by hook or by crook. So Faiz was arrested a few days before the first general election in the Punjab was going to be held.
Faiz remained in prison for 4 years, much of the time under threat of a death sentence. Some of his best poetry was written during this period.
मताए लौह कलम छिन गई तो क्या गम है कि खून दिल में डुबोली हैं उंगलियां मैंने जुबां पे मोहर लगी है तो क्या कि रख दी है हर एक हल्काए जंजीर में जुबां मैंने.
When he came back from jail, Pakistan had undergone a tremendous change. The democratic process had been halted, and political activity was being controlled. People were disillusioned, and preparations were being made to get the press.
In October 1958, General Ayub Khan and the Pakistan Army seized power to prevent the country's first ever general elections from taking place. All political activity was suppressed.
He was not here when martial law was formally imposed in October 1958 because he had, by some strange circumstance, allowed to go abroad. He had gone to Tashkent to take part in the founding of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau. And from there he went to London, and he was told that things were not good at home, but he insisted on coming home, and as somebody has pointed out, traveled from London to Lahore Fort on a single ticket. He was, this period of detention was not very long. He was detained for about 9 months or so.
Hockey colors, Ahmed Nisar Zaman, Shahnawaz Jamali,
As a direct consequence of Ayub Khan's decade in power, members of 22 identifiable families came to control most of the country's wealth. Under a facade of stability, Pakistan began its descent into chaos.
निसार मैं तेरी गलियों पे आ वतन
जी जी
निसार मैं तेरी गलियों पे वतन के जहाँ चली है रस्म से कोई न सर उठा के चले चली है रस्म कि कोई न सर उठा के चले जो कोई चाहने वाला तवाफ को निकले
जी
नजर चुरा के चले
ओह
जिसमें जान बचा के चले
वाह वाह वाह
जो कोई चाहने वाला
जी जी
तवाफ को निकले
तवाफ को निकले नजर चुरा
नजर चुरा के चले जिसमें जान बचा के चले
वाह वाह वाह
और बहुत है जुल्म के दस्ते बहाना जू के लिए ये चंद अहले जुनू तेरे नाम लेवा हैं
जी जी
ये चंद अहले जुनू तेरे नाम लेवा हैं बने हैं अहले हवस मुद्दई भी मुनसिफ भी
जी जी जी
बने हैं अहले हवस मुद्दई भी मुनसिफ भी किसे वकील करें किससे मुंसफी चाहें बने हैं अहले हवस मुद्दई भी मुनसिफ भी किसे वकील करें किनसे मुंसफी चाहें मगर गुजारने वालों के दिन गुजरते हैं
जी जी
मगर गुजारने वालों के दिन गुजरते हैं तेरे फिराक में यूं सुबह शाम करते हैं तेरे फिराक में यूं सुबह शाम करते हैं बुझा जो रोज़ जिंदा
जी
तो दिल ये समझा है कि तेरी मांग सितारों से भर गई होगी बुझा जो रोज़ में जिंदा तो दिल ये समझा है कि तेरी मांग सितारों से भर गई होगी और चमक उठे हैं सलासल
जी
तो हमने जाना है
जी
कि अब शहर तेरे रुख पर बिखर गई होगी हमने जाना है कि अब शहर तेरे रुख पर बिखर गई होगी तो यूं ही तसव्वुर शामो शहर में जीते हैं तसव्वुर शामो शहर में जीते हैं गिरफ्ते साया दीवारों दर्द जीते हैं
Faiz spent a number of years abroad, an opportunity made possible by the award of the Lenin Peace Prize in 1962. In November 1968, Pakistani students took to the streets, agitating against the Ayub dictatorship. The revolt spread across West and East Pakistan, with strikes and demonstrations flaring all over the country. In March 1969, Ayub handed over power to another general, Yahya Khan, and retired. The man who had spearheaded the anti-Ayub revolt was a former cabinet minister called Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. During these years, Faiz's published work was banned by the state. He returned to his old profession, teaching, and was appointed principal of a college in Karachi.
And he says, there is no scene in the world that is more beautiful, that is more fair, that is more pretty than the scene the city of London was presenting at that time. So he says, earth has not anything to show more fair. I mean, in the whole of the world, there is no scene that is as beautiful as the city of London is presenting in the early hours of the morning. Got it?
फैज पे अगर कोई क्रिटिसिज्म आप कह सकते हैं तो वो ये है कि उसकी लैंग्वेज का मसला है कि उर्दू में पोइट्री की उन्होंने और उर्दू यहाँ एक माइनॉरिटी की ज़ुबान थी उसके अलावा ख़ास तौर पे जो ऑप्रेस्ड नेशनैलिटीज़ थी उनमें एक रद्द अमल भी था उर्दू की तरफ इसलिए कि उनकी ज़बानों को दबाया जा रहा था और उर्दू को प्रमोट किया जा रहा था तो वो एक रिएक्शन भी था.
Now, the fact is that these nationalities, Punjabis, Pakhtuns, and Balochis, and Sindhis, are much older than Pakistan. Pakistan came into being in 1947, and these nationalities have been living in this region for thousands and thousands of years, Well, they have their own national identity, they have their own culture, they have their own language, their own literature, Now, Urdu came as an alien language, belonging to no particular region, and yet it became the sort of a national language.
तो फैज़ साहब की शायरी उस लिहाज से महदूद लैंग्वेज के लिहाज से हो गई थी कि वो पंजाब के लोगों में या उर्दू बोलने वालों में या फिर जो मिडिल क्लास एजुकेटेड लोग किसी भी नेशनैलिटी में थे उन तक वो पहुंचती थी और बाकी लोग उसको एंजॉय उस तरह से या अंडरस्टैंड नहीं कर सकते थे। तो ये एक है मसला। या फैज़ साहब खुद तो पंजाबी थे लेकिन पंजाबी में उन्होंने पोइट्री नहीं की थी, तो वो मेरे ख्याल में उस पूरे पीरियड का एक असर था। और प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स एसोसिएशन जो थी उसमें जो लोग थे वो बेसिकली उनकी एक मतलब यूनिवर्सल कैनवस थी।
In a country where there is still 75% illiteracy, the cinema has become the main source of mass entertainment. Pakistan's film industry was dominated until recently by films in Urdu, the language that Faiz wrote in. Now, regional languages are challenging that domination.
ये इधर लाइट शॉट, इधर ये कैमरा और एम्प्टी फ्रेम इधर पैन करें, एक माया मैनू अपनी बना ले पे आप मूवमेंट करेंगे ना तो थक यहाँ पर आ जाएंगे। ये सजानाते हाँ एक भारी मैनू अपनी बना ले तो थक हुआ
ऐसे में अपनी हाइट रखी।
हाँ सर टेक जी मार्क प्लीज। Faiz used quite skillfully, I think, the tradition of the poet in Indian Muslim society. He's allowed as a kind of license to criticize and a license to rail against the establishment, provided he does it within the framework of poetry. And the whole tradition of the ghazal, the traditional lyric, is one in which the establishment is very much assailed. And the poet is safe, provided he does that in that tradition. And one thing that it did for him was give him a popularity with the mass of people, because singers sing ghazals and they're recorded on records and long play things and all that. So lots of people who wouldn't have known or appreciated Faiz if he had not written ghazals appreciate him and know him and like him because he's
In 1970, the Bengalis of East Pakistan won a majority in the country's first ever general election. Generals in West Pakistan refused to recognize the verdict. A bloody civil war followed, at the end of which East Pakistan became the separate state of Bangladesh. Bhutto became Prime Minister of the now truncated Pakistan, the only elected leader in its tortured history. He appointed Faiz head of the Arts Council. For once, after a long time, Faiz could relax and paint without the fear of imprisonment.
By 1976, Pakistan had relapsed into one of its cyclic crises. And the reason again was that the political framework adopted by the rulers of Pakistan conflicted with the most fundamental interests of the people. And therefore, every 5 or 6 years, Pakistan became ungovernable. And force had to be resorted to keep the people quiet and to keep the ship of state sailing.
In July 1977, the country suffered its third military coup. General Zia-ul-Haq seized power in the name of Islam. Bhutto was arrested, tried for murder in a rigged court, and hanged. Pakistan was traumatized. Faiz, his work proscribed, watched helplessly as public floggings and hangings were instituted, all in the name of religion. Religion in the area that is now Pakistan had always been a relaxed affair. The old Sufi tradition had molded Islam. The spiritual and the physical were interwoven. Dogmas were disliked. Skepticism was respected. Every year there were commemorations of Sufi saints, days and nights of ecstatic dancing with strong undercurrents of eroticism. This was popular culture. Zia's zealots sought to extinguish this tradition. The shrines of the old Sufi saints, for centuries the focal points of popular celebration, were taken over by a government department. The sophisticated traditions of mosque architecture had to make way for mosques constructed after Saudi models.
और मेरे ख्याल में ये हमारी तारीख का बदतरीन मार्शल लॉ था। मार्शल लॉ के अलावा यूँ कहें कि ये पाकिस्तान की तारीख का बदतरीन दौर था और इसमें बहुत सी इंस्टीट्यूशंस को, बहुत से इदारों को जिसके लिए जिनकी ज़रूरत एक नौदमीदा बात को होती है वो सारे ख़त्म कर दी गए। आमरीत मुसल्लत कर दी गई और फिर सिर्फ यही नहीं कि सियासी तौर पर कुचल दिया गया हो पाकिस्तानी अवाम को, बल्कि इसके असरात अदब पे पड़े, कल्चर पे पड़े, मौसीकी के रुख बदल दिए गए, अदब को सरकारी अदब बना दिया गया, सेंसरशिप, फिर उसके बाद सहाफ़ियों को कोड़े मारना, देवर फ्लॉग्ड ऑन रोड साइड, उससे एक अजीब तरह की दहशत और एक मकरूह सी फजा पैदा हो गई।
एक बार हमें जेल खाने से निकल के शहर में से गुजरना पड़ा टांगे पर।
ये मैं आपका
वरना तो में ले जाते तो फिर टांगे पर गुजरना पड़ा। ये उसके लिए लिखा था कि इसमें नम जाने चोरीदा काफी नहीं, जाने चोरीदा काफी नहीं, तो मत इश्क पोशीदा काफी नहीं। आज बाजार में पाबजौला चलो, आज बाजार में
पाबजौला चलो,
पाबजौला चलो, दस्त अफसा चलो, मस्त रफ्सा चलो, खाक बरसर चलो, खूब बदामा चलो, खाक बरसर चलो, खूब बदामा चलो, राह तकता है सब चेहरे जाना चलो, राह तकता है सब चेहरे जाना चलो, हाकम शहर भी मजमाए आम भी, हाकम शहर भी मजमाए आम भी, सुबह नाशाद भी रोज नाकाम भी, तीरे इल्जाम भी, तीरे इल्जाम भी, संग दुश्नाम भी, इनका दमसाज अपने सिवा कौन है, इनका दमसाज
अपने सिवा कौन,
अपने सिवा कौन है, तेरे जाना में अब बासफा कौन है, तेरे जाना में अब बासफा कौन है, दस्ते कातिल के छाया रहा कौन है, दस्ते कातिल के छाया रहा कौन है, रख दिल बांध लो दिल से यारो चलो, फिर हम ही कत्ल हुआ यारो चलो,
फिर हम ही कत्ल हो
फिर ये हुआ कि कुछ लोग मुल्क से या तो जेल में चले गए या कोड़े खा के अस्पतालों में चले गए या फिर तंग आके उस घुटन से बाहर निकल गए, मुल्क से दूर चले गए। जहाँ जहाँ जिसको पनाह मिली या जो जो ठिकाना उनकी समझ में आया वहाँ चले गए। उन्हीं में से फैज साहब भी थे।
He was forced to go, you can put it in that way, and yet it was also self-exile. It was those things together.
Faiz went to Beirut to edit an Afro-Asian literary magazine, Lotus. He became friends with Yasser Arafat and identified himself closely with the Palestinian cause.
And when I saw where they lived in this little apartment, the 6th floor in Raushe, so different from what they had been used to in Lahore, where they had the ground under their feet and trees over them, and he could look out of his window and see the greenery. He used to instead, sit in the balcony in the evening and look out towards the sea, where sometimes you could see the Israeli gunboats firing, and of course smoke, as he always did very heavily. Sometimes go for a walk, and his homesickness was so tangible, it was so concrete, you felt it. He just exuded this feeling.
मेरे दिल मेरे मुसाफिर हुआ फिर से हुक्म सादिर कि वतन बदर हो हम तुम दें गली गली सदाएं करें रुख नगर नगर का कि सुराग कोई पाएं किसी यार नाम बर का हर एक अजनबी से पूछें जो पता था अपने घर का सरे कुएं नाशनाया हमें दिन से रात करना कभी इससे बात करना कभी उससे बात करना तुम्हें क्या कहूँ कि क्या है शबे गम बुरी बला है हमें ये भी था गनीमत जो कोई शुमार होता हमें क्या बुरा था मरना अगर एक बार होता मेरे दिल मेरे मुसाफिर.
We thought that Beirut obviously could not work indefinitely. The Lotus could, but not being in Beirut. And then I was homesick for the children. The house was closed up. One's friends kept writing and saying how... And Faiz obviously wanted to go back, come what may. What could be worse than prison in the conspiracy case and prison after the coup d'etat? Nothing could be worse than that. And by that time he was a figure of international status. And he thought, well, now is the time one can go home, go to prison if it may be. And he was definitely homesick and he wanted to be back. And he was tired of traveling.
After nearly 5 years abroad, Faiz returned to Lahore, the city of light. His poetry was more popular than ever, but was never broadcast by the government-controlled media. Faiz Ahmed Faiz died within a year of his return.